All right, the passage reads, Albert Einstein believed that imagination was more important than knowledge, as he famously stated that while knowledge is limited, imagination encircles the world. Okay, so there are several concepts that we have to unpack, right, from this question. First of all, we do know just by taking a brief overview of the answer choices, a broad level view of the answers, we can see that we're being tested on punctuation, right? We have various punctuation marks like semicolons, periods, colons, and commas, right? And we know that when we're tested on punctuations, almost always we're also going to be tested on sentence structure as well. Okay, so remember, you guys, sentence structure is basically just how sentences are structured, right? Structured, when you structure something, you're building it, right? So sentence structure really just refers to how sentences are built, right? And in order for you guys to master sentence structure or punctuation, you not only have to learn punctuation rules, but you also have to learn foundational knowledge about sentences, right? About the structure of sentences. So what I mean by this is like the thing that most students will struggle with, right? When it comes to the grammar section of the SAT, is they don't have a very solid foundation, right, of the components of a sentence, right, that you can use to create different sentence structures. Okay, so I have a whole lesson around this. In fact, I have a whole course around this that I'm building because I think it's that important, and so many students lack this foundation. So let me just try to go ahead and briefly talk about at least some of the elements that I'm referring to, okay? So what you do have to learn, you guys, is you have to learn the different components of a sentence, okay? A component is just basically a part, right? So there are various parts of a sentence that you have to be familiar with, right? Not just familiar with, but you have to like be able to recognize it, identify it, right? Track it, right? And analyze it, you know, and that can be hard to do, right? When the sentence that you're given is very complicated, okay? So there are 5 basic components of a sentence that you have to be extremely familiar with, right? So the first and the most important one is an independent clause, right? An IC. We also have a dependent clause. Let's call that a DC. We have a phrase. Let's just call that a PH. Okay, these 3 components are what I call the big components. Okay, when you have a very complex sentence, you oftentimes see, right, many or several of these components kind of combined together, right? So you might see like a dependent clause combined with an independent clause, right? Or you might see like a phrase, comma, independent clause, comma, phrase, right? Comma, fanboy's word, you know, and another independent clause, right? So you can have like, you know, various components kind of combined together to create different types of sentences, right? Or different types of sentence structures, okay? So these 3 big components are basically, these components are used to, so one component is kind of separated from another component, right, with punctuation, right? So when we have, for example, like a dependent clause that comes before an independent clause, we know that, you know, there has to be a comma to separate this big component, a DC, right, from this another big component, this independent clause, this IC. So there are various punctuation rules that you have to know, but you know, in order for you to know how to apply these punctuation rules, you have to understand the different components of a sentence, okay? And then you also have these 2 small components of a sentence, right? And those would be like a list, right? A list of items, and then we also have adjectives in a list, okay? And the reason why I call these small components is because oftentimes you're gonna see punctuation marks placed between words within each component, within these components. So for example, when you have a list of like 3 items, right? I love basketball, comma, right? Running, comma, and golf, right? Well, you oftentimes see punctuation marks, right? Within words, well, between words within that component. So no longer are you using punctuation marks to separate one component from another component, but instead you're using punctuation marks to separate words within one component. Does that make sense? This is also true with adjectives in a list as well, right? So And these are the 5 components that you have to master, right? In order to, this is like the foundational knowledge pieces that every single person has to learn very well, has to master, right? If they want to then go on, right, to solve punctuation questions extremely effectively. Okay. So this is going to be a good starting point for y'all, right? And again, in future videos, because I can talk about these components for hours, I am creating a course around this, but I think a lot of you guys need help before the course gets released, right? So I will be kind of releasing these small short videos talking about these different components, right? To help you guys out. Okay, but this is just kind of like a precursor to it. Now, the component that you're going to have to be familiar with for this particular question, you guys, is a dependent clause. Okay, so a dependent clause. So there are different types of dependent clauses in the English language. There's actually 3 different types, right? So one of the types of dependent clauses that you have to be familiar with is, so let me just write that here, 3 types of DCs, right? Dependent clauses, okay? So the first type I think most of you guys are familiar with, right? This is when you have a word like while, or a word like since, right? Or like after, or like before, okay? These words are called subordinating conjunctions, okay? Well, subordinating conjunctions can oftentimes be used before, right, a sentence to create a dependent clause, okay? So for example, if I said something like, I ran to the store, okay? If I just had the sentence, I ran to the store, this would be a complete sentence, right? Everyone can see that this is a complete sentence. A complete sentence has a subject, I, it has a verb ran, and it has a complete thought, right? So I ran to the store is a finished idea, okay? So this is what's called an independent clause. However, right, when we put one of these subordinating conjunctions, right, stick the word while in front of this, then now you're going to turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. A dependent clause is an incomplete sentence, right? So when I say, while I ran to the store, your brain goes, wait, what happened? What happened while you ran to the store, right? If I say, after I ran to the store, right, your brain recognizes that as being incomplete, right? What happened after I ran to the store, right? Before I ran to the store. None of these sound complete, right? Well, that's this first type of dependent clause, okay? It's a dependent clause where a subordinating conjunction is placed in front of an independent clause, which turns it into an incomplete sentence, right? Or dependent clause, right? Which is what you see here, okay? And you guys, there's too many subordinating conjunctions in the English language for you guys to memorize, right? So don't try to memorize it, just get familiar with it. Be able to recognize and see it when it appears in a sentence, okay? Because when it appears in a sentence, your brain should go, oh, okay, this is going to be a dependent clause, right? Now, why is that important, right? Well, it's important because of sentence structure, okay? Because if you end a sentence with a dependent clause, right, it's not a complete sentence, right? So you have to have something else, okay? Here's what I mean, right? So if I just have, so this is going to be the first type of dependent clause, you guys, yeah? And if I have this type of dependent clause, right, I can't just finish the sentence here, right? I have to have like a comma, and then I have to have an independent clause. So if I said or if I said after I ran to the store, comma, you say, I don't know, I bought a bottle of water, right? I bought some water is now your complete sentence. Like that's your independent clause, right? So you can't just end the sentence with before I ran to the store, right? Or after I ran to the store. You have to have another component, an independent clause, right, to make this a complete sentence, okay? That's the first type of DC. I didn't think that I would be going this deep into dependent clauses, but this is just my nature, you guys. Yeah, I know this is going to help some of you guys, because if you're listening up until this point, right, it means that you're interested, right? So I'll continue listening, and I'll show you guys. I'll teach you guys a lot of other really cool stuff about dependent clauses that most of you guys probably didn't know before. Okay, so I'm glad I have your attention. If you turned off this video, I mean, I think it's your loss, but maybe you know this stuff already. Who knows, right? Wish you guys the best of luck regardless. I sincerely mean that. The second type of dependent clause that you're going to see is what is known as a relative clause. Okay. Now, this is going to be a long lesson, you guys, for one particular question, but it's necessary, I think, because this sentence might be complex, or it's not necessarily difficult to answer. But if you know the foundational knowledge pieces that I'm teaching you right now, you'll not only be able to solve this type of question, but you'll be able to solve all other questions that ask you about dependent clauses as part of sentence structure, right? And so this is going to be really helpful, right, for you guys in that sense. Okay. So the second type of dependent clause, you guys, is what's called a relative clause. Now, a relative clause is created by a relative pronoun. So relative clauses begins with a relative pronoun, and there are seven relative pronouns in the English language. And you guys are familiar with these. You guys just don't know necessarily the terminology behind it, right? So relative pronouns would be words like who, whom, right? Which, that, right? We also have whose, and then we have when and where. Okay, when and where could also be relative pronouns. Okay, although these words can also be other types of other things as well in the English language. These things can function as relative pronouns, right? Now, it just depends on the sentence that's being created at the time. Now, like I said, a relative clause, right, begins with a relative pronoun, and it always has a verb inside of it. Okay. But this is going to create a dependent clause, and a dependent clause is not a complete sentence, right? It's not a complete sentence. It's an incomplete sentence. Right? And the other thing too, you guys, is if you're taking notes on this, great. One of the things I want you guys to drill into your brains or circle is the word verb, okay? Next to a dependent, when you write down a dependent clause and you're trying to define it, it's not only an incomplete sentence, but also note this. Dependent clauses must always have a verb inside of it, okay? It always has a verb inside of it, okay? Always. It's one of the things that you have to know about dependent clauses, because one of the ways that the SAT will try to trick you with dependent clauses or with sentence structure errors is by creating dependent clauses without actual verbs in it. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? Dependent clauses, not a complete sentence. In other words, it cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. And two, dependent clauses always, not sometimes, not most of the time, but always have a verb inside of it. Okay, so that's really good to know. Okay, so now this type of dependent clause, you guys, a relative clause, its function is to describe the noun that came before it. So a relative clause's function or its job is to describe the noun that it came before it. Okay, now the noun that appears before the relative pronoun is going to determine which relative pronoun you use to create the relative clause. Because now we're getting into pronouns, right? So if the noun that appears, and you guys know this, you guys do, it's just that you guys weren't taught this in this way. So guys, if I tell you that if the noun that appears before the relative pronoun is a person, is referring to people, right? Whether it's a baker, a student, fans, whatever, right? Which relative pronouns can you use to create relative clauses? Well, that would be, you could use who. So you could say the people who, right? Or the people whom. You could also use whose, okay? So whose is going to be the only relative pronoun that's the possessive form. So whose is the only possessive form for a relative pronoun, okay? But when you have a noun that's a person or referring to people, you can use who, whom, or whose. When the noun that appears before a relative clause is like an object, is a thing, then you can use which or that, right? When it's a place, you can use where. When it's a time or an event, you can use when, right? But anyways, the point is this relative clause is used to describe the noun that appears before it, right? So if I said, oh, the student who is studying in the library, right? The student who is studying in the library. Well, who is studying is your dependent clause. My face is kind of covering this a little bit. I'm just recognizing that right now, but that's okay. Who is studying is your relative clause, right? And that's a type of dependent clause. Now, what is it modifying? If I ask you the question, well, who is studying? You'd be like, oh, it was the student, right? So that's what these relative clauses do. These relative clauses will always modify or describe the noun that appears before it. Okay, that's this job of this type of dependent clause. Okay, so we have two types of dependent clauses so far, right? We have the one with the subordinated conjunction, right? Words like while, since, before, although, after, as soon as, whether, right? Those ones that turn an independent clause into a dependent clause or an incomplete sentence. Now we also have these relative clauses as well. Right, now remember, guys, the job of relative clause is to what? Is to always describe the noun that appears before it, right? Now, also remember that relative clauses or dependent clauses must always have what inside of it? Must always have a verb inside of it. Okay, so the verb inside of this relative clause is going to be the verb is, right? Is. That's your verb here. Okay, so that's the second type of dependent clause, you guys, right? Now, the third type of dependent clause that you need to know that oftentimes appears on the SAT, which you see two types of dependent clauses that appear. Actually, you see three. I'm going to say two. Okay, you see two types of dependent clauses that appear in this sentence for sure. This is why you have to be familiar with this, because the SAT loves to use dependent clauses to create complex and complicated sentence structures to make your lives difficult, right? So you want to strategize against them, right, by learning these components extremely, extremely well, okay? So the third type of dependent clause that we have, you guys, is what's called a noun clause, all right? So a noun clause is gonna be formed with the 5 W's, and then we also have how, the H, and then we also have that. Okay, so these are the words that can be used to create a noun clause, which is another type of dependent clause. Right, now remember, you guys, dependent clauses always have what inside of it? Must always have a verb inside of it, right? Keep that in mind, because that's going to be very helpful in future cases when you're being tested on sentence structure and dependent clauses. Okay, because the SAT loves to create sentence structure errors that test you on dependent clauses themselves, right? There might be an incorrect form in the dependent clause that you have to fix, right? Which a lot of students don't know, because the most common sentence structure errors that students are taught is run-on sentences and fragments. But there's a third category, which I'll teach you guys a little bit later. But one of the things that they test you on in that third category of errors is going to be incorrectly formed dependent clauses, okay? But anyways, this type of dependent clause is created by these 5 W's. What are the 5 W's? You guys have learned in writing, right? The 5 W's. We have like who, what, where, when, why, right? And then we also have the how, and then we have the that, okay? Now you might be asking me, you're like, well, wait a second, Jin, right? You just told us that who and that were relative pronouns that are used to create relative clauses. Well, that's true. And this is what makes the English language difficult, is that who and that could also be words that are used to create noun clauses as well. And this is what makes the English language kind of complicated, right? So it all kind of depends on how these words are used in context. In other words, right, how these words are used in the sentence that you're reading or you're evaluating, right? The sentence that's written, in other words, okay? So how the sentence is written is going to determine, right, what form this word takes, right? Is it going to be used as a noun clause, or is it going to be used as a relative clause, right? It's going to depend on the sentence that you're given, okay? So examples of these, right? So the function of these noun clauses, you guys, yeah, they're used in 2 ways mainly, right? So the SAT does kind of use both of these ways, especially for harder or more challenging sentence structure questions, okay? So one of the ways that they use these noun clauses is as a subject of a sentence, right? You're like, what? Some of you guys have seen sentences like this, though, right? You guys are now just starting to recognize that you guys are now starting to put words to it. You're starting to label it, right? Oh, that's a noun clause, okay? So you might have a sentence that reads something like, if I say something like, what is amazing? What is amazing about technology? What is amazing about technology is, right? What is amazing about technology is just how quickly, right? How quickly, whatever, how quickly information. This isn't that important. Information can spread. Okay. So excuse my terrible sentence. I know it's not eloquent, but it doesn't matter. The point that I want you guys to notice, right, is this, right? What is amazing about technology? This is going to be your noun clause, right? Noun clauses again begins with what? One of those 5 W's. In this case, it begins with the what, right? The what, or a how, or a that, right? But notice how in this case, you guys, this is the subject of a sentence, right? Now I mentioned to you guys is, well, one, noun clauses are dependent clauses, right? Are dependent clauses complete sentences? Nope, they're not complete sentences, right? Dependent clauses are incomplete sentences, right? What is the one thing that I told you guys? Not the one thing, but what is one is super important thing that you always must keep in mind when you have a dependent clause, right? Dependent clauses always have what inside of it? They always have a verb inside of it, right? So you see that verb here, right? Is. Okay, you notice that, right? What is amazing about technology? We also know it's not a complete sentence, right? Because that's what a dependent clause is. It's not a complete sentence. So in other words, we can't just have this as a complete sentence, right? What is amazing about technology? That's not a complete sentence, right? This is why we have a verb here, and this is your main verb, right? So your subject is what, and then your main verb is, right? So what is amazing about technology is how quickly information can spread, right? That's your complete sentence. Okay. So these noun clauses can be used, in this way as subjects of a sentence, which you'll see. Yeah. Note also, this is going to be for future cases. They test you on verbs in this way. Is these noun clauses are always singular. The subject is always singular, right? This is why you see the verb is as opposed to like are. Okay. So like words like what and like, if I say, how the magician performed the trick baffles me to this day, right? Well, how is the subject there, and it's also singular. Okay, so these noun clauses are always singular, and they can be used as subjects of a sentence. They could also be used as part of. Uh, they can be used to connect an independent clause to create a really complete sentence. Okay, so this case, you're going to see like an independent clause plus this noun clause. I'm going to put NC as noun clause. And this is going to be used to create a very complete and clear sentence. You'll see what I mean. So if I say something like, I don't know, right? If you just have that as a sentence, right? Out of context, if you just had this sentence, it'd be kind of weird. So I don't know. We don't know what, right? So when you read this, it'd be like, it's not really a complete sentence. Okay. If of course, if you had a different context, right? You're like, hey, do you know who cheated on the test? You're like, I don't know. Right. Well, that's okay. But if you just have a sentence and nothing else, it says, I don't know, it's not a complete sentence, right? It's kind of weird. So you can combine this with a noun clause, right? So if I say, I don't know, and then I say here, let's use the word who. Okay, this is going to be there's a reason for this. I don't know who ate the cookie. Okay, so now we have, you notice this, right? I don't know is like this independent clause part of this complete sentence. It's combined with a noun clause, right? Again, which is a dependent clause, right? Who ate the cookie, right? These noun clauses begin with those 5 W's or a how or that, right? Now, again, notice how in this case, you guys, who ate the cookie, right? You know that this is not a relative clause. You know it's not a relative clause because why? Relative clauses they're supposed to describe the noun that appears before it. But in this sentence, do we have a noun that appears before this who clause? No, right? I don't know, right? Know is a verb, right? So you don't have a noun that appears before this noun clause, right? Before this dependent clause. So this is how you know that this dependent clause is not a relative clause, but it's a noun clause. Okay, so that's where I told you guys, right? Even though we see the word who isn't always used in as a relative clause. Who can also be used in another way, right? So it just depends on the sentence that you're given. Okay, so you always have to think about the context, right, of the sentence that you're given, right, to determine kind of what component you might have. Okay, so can you see this now? What did I tell you guys as well? These noun clauses are dependent clauses, and dependent clauses must always have what inside of it? Must always have a verb inside of it, right? And so now the verb here is going to be ate. Okay, cool. So guys, those are the three different types of dependent clauses that you're going to encounter on this test. Now, let's put this all together. Why is that super important, right? Well, because you might get a very complex sentence structure, right, that tests you on punctuation and sentence structure simultaneously, okay? So this is where you guys, right, it's really important that you learn how to track, right, the different components, right, how to track the different components of a sentence. Okay, so what do I mean by tracking? Tracking is be able to identify when a component, like a dependent clause, begins, and then to be able to follow it, to be able to and figure out where it should end. Okay, now this can be kind of simple in a lot of cases, but it can get very tricky. The SAT is known to make extremely tricky sentence structures, right, where they add component after component after component, making it very difficult to track or keep track of these components. Okay, now let me show you what I mean. I do see that here. Okay, so notice here this. So Albert Einstein believed that imagination was more important than knowledge. This is actually your independent clause. Then we have a comma here. Now we have a dependent clause, right? As we have a subject and a verb, right? He stated, right? Now, as he famously stated, well, what did he famously state? Okay, so now notice how when you read this part, he famously stated that. I notice, oh my gosh, I have another dependent clause here that's beginning, right? What do you know about a dependent clause? A dependent clause must always have a verb inside of it, right? Well, if we read this dependent clause, this that clause, right? Well, it has to have a verb. But what comes right after this word that, right? Well, we have another dependent clause that appears, right? He stated that while. Ooh, we have that subordinating conjunction, right? We have that subordinating conjunction, that first type of dependent clause that I mentioned earlier, right? Words like since or while or as or after, right? These are subordinating conjunctions that create dependent clauses, right? Well, now we have another dependent clause here. Now, where does this one end, right? So if it says, while knowledge is limited, right? While knowledge is limited, it ends right over here. So this dependent clause, the one that begins with the word while, ends with limited. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it leaves the other dependent clause, the that dependent clause, it leaves this that dependent clause, right, incomplete. So now we have a messed up sentence structure, right? We don't have a complete sentence, right? So we have to be able to finish this that clause, right, with a sort of, a verb in it, right, or complete thought as well. Okay, and so this, knowing that, you guys, hopefully this is easy for you guys to follow. You guys are able to follow this. It'll all make sense right now, hopefully. This is where we kind of combine, right, the different components of a sentence that we learned. That's super important for everyone to know. We combine that with punctuation rules. Okay, combining that with punctuation rules is really where we get mastery. right, is really where we obtain the mastery over these question types, okay, over this question type. So what's the punctuation rule for a semicolon? Well, the punctuation rule for a semicolon is we have IC, semicolon, IC, right? We have to have a complete sentence, semicolon, complete sentence, right? Independent clause, semicolon, independent clause, right? Well, we just found out that the information before the semicolon is not a complete sentence, right? It's not complete. Well, why? Because we don't have a correctly or completely formed dependent clause. This that clause is incomplete, right? Because it lacks a verb in it. And we mentioned earlier that every dependent clause must always have what inside of it? Must always have a verb inside of it, right? Must always have a verb inside of it, okay? And we'll see that with some other answer choices. Can you guys all see that it's not a complete sentence, right? This is why A is going to be incorrect, because we don't have an IC or a complete sentence before the semicolon. Now, using that same logic, we can also cross out B as well, right? Because we know that the punctuation rule for a period is exactly the same as a semicolon, right? It separates two complete sentences, okay? And we know, again, right, we don't have a complete sentence before the period, because we already looked at that, right, before the semicolon. Okay, so we can automatically cross out B as well. And for the same reason, we can also cross out C. Okay, so guys, if you're not familiar with this punctuation mark, a colon, you have to, there's two main rules that you have to know about a colon. I'll just teach you guys one of them now. And there's actually three rules that you have to know, two big ones, but I'll just share with you guys one of them now, because I think I already gave you guys a lot of information that you guys have to process. So I don't want to bomb you guys with any more, right? And not too much information, right? I just want to give you guys the things that you guys need right now, okay? And a little bit extras too, right? That's related, that'll help you out with other sentence structure questions, okay? So anyways, the first rule that you have to know for a colon, you guys, is the information before the colon has to be a complete sentence. Has to be a complete sentence, okay? So we already know that it's not, right? Because again, this dependent clause is not correctly formed, right? It's lacking a verb, right? Don't say that is my verb, right? Because is my verb for this dependent clause, right? While knowledge is limited. Is not the verb for the other dependent clause, that dependent clause, right? So this is why you want to cross out C as well. Now look at what answer choice D does. Right? D does something pretty cool. Okay, so answer choice D will use a comma. Now, what is the purpose of this comma? Well, one of the comma rules that you must know, it's a very simple one, but it does appear very often on the SAT, is you always put a comma when a dependent clause comes before an independent clause. Okay, and you'll kind of see what I mean by an independent clause looking thing. But we notice here, right, while knowledge is limited is a dependent clause, right? It's that type of dependent clause with the subordinate conjunction, right? While knowledge is limited, it's not complete. Well, what about it, right? This is why we need a comma here to separate that DC from now. We're going to call this like an independent clause in quotation marks. It is really part of that dependent clause, but these noun clauses, when you use the that clause as a noun clause, they do form an independent clause, right? After the noun of that. Okay, nothing to get too worked up with right now, but just know that we have imagination encircles the world. Okay, imagination encircles the world. Right, so that'll be now. So now let's just try this. Let's cross out while knowledge is limited, because that's our dependent clause. Right, now let's read. So it says, as he famously stated that imagination encircles the world. Now, doesn't that sound like a complete sentence? Right? And it sounds like a complete sentence because that clause is always going to be used as a dependent clause. Okay? It can be used as a relative clause in some cases, but it can also be used as a noun clause in other cases. Okay, but that clause is always a dependent clause, and we know that dependent clauses must always have a verb inside of it, right? So the verb inside of this dependent clause is going to be in circles, right? So he stated that imagination encircles the world, right? That imagination encircles the world, right? So, boom. Now we have a complete sentence, right? And this is why D is going to be your correct answer for this question. Okay. So good. I hope this really helped you guys out. Do me a favor, you guys. Please, and I sincerely mean this, it's not just to get more likes or subscribers or more eyes on my channel, although that would be great. I'm trying to help out as many people as I possibly can. For free, right? Really give you guys top 99 percentile instruction. And of course, I want to reach as many people as possible. So if you guys could help out there, that would be incredible. But I think more importantly, for your sake, because remember, you guys, my number one goal for each and every one of you is to help you miss fewer than 5 questions consistently, right? That's my number one goal. That is the goal that I placed above all other goals. My main goal, this is my North Star, right? That North Star, right, is supersedes everything else. In other words, all other goals, right, fall beneath this main goal, right? So my main goal isn't to get you guys to like me. My main goal isn't for you guys to click the subscribe button, right? My main goal isn't for you guys to click the notification bell, and click the like button. Those aren't my main goals. My main goal is to help you guys miss fewer than 5 questions consistently. Now, how can you help me do that? How can you help me help you do that? Is one, I can't read your minds, right? So what I need you guys to do is I need you guys to do a couple of things. In the comment section, in the comment box, first, I want you guys to tell me one thing that you learned today. Okay? One thing that you learned today. This thing could be something new that you didn't know before, right? Or this thing could be something that you learned better. You kind of knew, but you learned better. Or that'll really give me a good sense of where you guys are at, right? On your SAT grammar journey. Okay, now each of you guys is going to be on a different part of the journey, right? This is why I just need as many of you guys. I would love all of you guys to tell me, right? One thing that you guys learned today, right? That's one thing. Two, tell me one thing that you need help with, right? Try to identify one specific question. Specific question. Don't just say, I need help with grammar, right? That's not specific. Try to be as specific or as precise as possible. Or just say, oh, Jin, commas confuse the heck out of me. I need help with commas, right? Can you teach me the things that I need to know about commas? And if you can point to a particular question where the comma kind of confused you, even better, right? But that's better, you know. Identify one thing that you need help with, and the reason I ask you guys to do that is I read all of the comments, and I'll comment on them. I might not comment on all of them because I am, enrolled as a PhD student. So I'm getting my PhD right now. And so I don't have a lot of time, right? I only have 1 day a week, half a day actually, to create as many of these videos as possible for y'all. But I do look at the comments and I do create videos. Like your comments inspire me to create videos, right? So the more that you can communicate with me, right, the more that you guys can just really sit in silence and really just try to think about and identify, right, what problem are you having? And then try to articulate that in writing, in written form, as clearly as possible. Okay, as clearly as possible. Don't just write like you text your friends, right? Write this in a clear way. Okay, be honest. So that's the second thing that I want you guys to do. The third thing is, please write down one thing that you felt was meaningful for you, right? What was helpful for you? Okay, and those 3 things are things that I would love for you guys to to write in the comment box, that'll help me out a lot. Because guys, I am extremely committed and I love helping students master this stuff, right? I made a career out of this, a very successful career out of this. I'm currently in the PhD program because I have a new sort of calling that I want to pursue, but I don't want to give this up as well. Okay. So while I'm in school, I want to try to help out as many of you guys as possible. So the way that you guys can count me out again is communicate with me in the comment box. And also, you guys, please like and share, subscribe to the channel, like and share these videos because it really does help spread the word, right? And I'm on a mission and I can't do this myself. I need your help, right? The more you guys can help me out, right, the more I'll know what to do to help you guys out as well. Okay. So please, that would be incredible if you guys could support in that way. Um, yeah, guys, again, I'll see you in the next video. The next video will be much shorter, I hope. But I'll see you guys in the next video when we talk about another grammar question, right? Take care, you guys. I'll see you soon.